So welcome everybody. I guess that people are slowly joining us today. It's such a pleasure to welcome you at this November edition of Data for Peace Dialogues hosted by NYU Center on International Cooperation. Data for Peace Dialogues is a monthly webinar series organized as part of NYU Center on International Cooperation Data for Peacebuilding and Prevention program. And the dialogues elaborate on examples and recommendations presented in the latest report on ecosystem mapping, the state of play, and the path to creating a community of practice. So I'm thrilled to welcome our guests today, whose organizations were mapped in our report, and their work presented as an example of a cutting-edge approach in utilizing data for peace. They're joining us today to share the insights from their work on COVID-19 and COVID-19 disorder tracker and COVID-19 violence tracker. And welcome to, first of all, Paige Arthur, who is here in front of our hosts, New York University Center on International Cooperation. Welcome to another colleague from CIC, Céline Monnier, who is a Senior Program Officer at Center on International Cooperation. Welcome to Tim Receiver, who is Director of Programs at Peacebuilding Lab. And welcome to Ruda Bekishi, Director of Research and Innovation at ACLED. And my name is Branka Panic, and I'm a non-resident fellow at NYU CIC, and I'm a founder of AI for Peace. And of course, a big welcome to our audience today. I see people are still joining the session, so just a couple of housekeeping rules before we start. We will hear the presentations from our guests first, and then we will have a question and answer session at the end. So feel free to write your questions throughout the discussion, and we will respond to as many as we can at the end of the discussion. I would also like to thank to everybody who submitted their questions through registration form, and we will incorporate those questions in the discussion as well. So we gathered today to discuss the impact of COVID-19 on peace and conflict. And what we saw since the beginning of this crisis and the pandemic is that many responses have focused on mitigating health and also socioeconomic risks and impacts of the pandemic. But what is important for us and what we will be discussing today is also that COVID-19 has significantly affected peace, security, conflict, and violence, and in many cases, reversing pre-pandemic peace building gains and many developments that happened before the crisis. So we saw at the very beginning that a pandemic started postponing elections, and then we also saw the implementation of different peace agreements. We saw obstructed mediation efforts and many impacts that our speakers will share with you today. But to better understand the impacts of COVID and potentially even predict the threats of COVID-related violence, we are organizing this discussion today, and we are dedicating our November edition of Data for Peace Dialogues to this topic. So with this, I would like to invite Paige Arthur as our host today to welcome us and to say a couple of words about Peace Building and Prevention Program and the goals behind it. Paige, welcome.
Thank you, Branka, and thanks to everybody for joining. As Branka mentioned, this is our second in our new series on the Data for Peace dialogues, and this is part of CIC's new initiative to try to strengthen this community of practice of people using data-driven approaches to tackle practical peace building and prevention problems. And I would like to send a big thank you to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Netherlands for supporting this initiative. I think, Branka, you've really summarized the framing very well. I think it's very important for all of us to be paying attention to this issue of how pre-pandemic peacebuilding gains may be reversed in the current environment, and what can we do to understand the very clear and present risks of COVID-related violence. So I'm very excited to hear from Tim and from Rudebe about the big insights from big data on the intersection of COVID and risks for peace. But first, I'm delighted to invite my colleague, Céline Monnier, to share with us some reflections on why this issue is so important. Céline, over to you.
Thank you, Paige. I'm just going to share my PowerPoint right now. Okay, I hope you can see the PowerPoint. So good morning to all of you. I'm really happy that we're having this conversation today. And I would like to spend my presentation explaining why I'm so happy we're having this conversation. And so I'd like to discuss particularly 3 points. The first one is, what is COVID-19 doing to peace? The second one is, why can't we wait to talk about peace? And the third one is, why is data so important in that conversation? So the first question, what is COVID-19 response doing to peace? So particularly, what are the measures we're taking to contain the pandemic, such as lockdowns, border closure, movement restriction in general? What are they doing to peace across the world? So there's some direct effects that we've already seen, right? There's been a huge rise, for instance, in domestic violence during the lockdowns. We've also seen a lot of violence for the enforcement of lockdowns. There's also some more longer-term effects on peace. For instance, the disruption of peace-building activities. So Branka was mentioning, for instance, the disruption of mediation, preventative diplomacy. Those are activities that are really important for people to have in-person meetings, to build trust, to be able to share sensitive information. And it's a lot harder to conduct those activities through Zoom or phone calls. And this is the same for all the peace-building activities that take place at field level, right? If you think about community building, reconciliation, just all the peace building that involve dialogue, in-person dialogues are being disrupted by social distancing measures. The other longer-term effect that we really need to pay attention to is, what are those measures that we're taking to contain the pandemic doing to our society? What are they doing to our social contract? And very often, they are deepening social fractures that were already there, right? So to give you just a banal example, but we talk about working from home, which probably for most of us on this call looks like this. And if we think about the informal sector, that might look more like this, right? It's like you have to give up your income, you're falling outside of social safety net, and you also contributing to this effort, so hospitals are not overwhelmed, but you never had access to hospital in the first place, right? And all of this creates a lot of feelings of injustices, of grievances and frustration. And this is the same, for instance, for access to services. We're told all the time, wash your hands, if you don't have access to running water, right? And so those are the grievances that are building and building and building, and we called risk factor because at some point people become so frustrated, it becomes so unfair that may transform into violence. The second question is, why can we wait to talk about peace, right? So very often we think, okay, we're in the middle of a health crisis. Let's just focus on health. We'll think about peace later. And I would like to present 2 arguments why we shouldn't do that. The first argument is that prevention is so much easier and it's so much cheaper than addressing the conflict, right? So right now, in many places, we have to address the risk factor. If we wait, those risk factors may actually transform into violence. And then you not only still have to deal with those risk factors that are now root causes for your conflict, but you have to deal with life loss, economic cost, reconstruction cost, displacement, and so on and so on. The second argument is that we are going to have economic slowdown worldwide because of the crisis, right? So GDP of donor countries are going to decrease very likely in the coming years. And very often international assistance or peacebuilding assistance is linked to the GDP. So we will have less money for peacebuilding. So we have, on the one hand, more risk factors that may transform into violence and less money to address those risk factors. So the more we wait to talk about peace, the more difficult it is to be able to actually do something for peace. And so that brings me to the last question. Why does data matter to have this conversation? And so recently, I conducted a study across the UN system and I interviewed UN staff to understand how we're thinking about peace when we respond to COVID-19. And the short answer is that we don't. So there is no overall peace strategy and there is very limited conflict sensitivity. We're thinking short term. And so I'm asking this question, why, right? And I think one hypothesis is that we don't have enough data to talk about peace. And so in the short term, we know that we've lost 1.40 million lives due to COVID-19. And we know that in the long term, the risk factor for conflict are increasing. We know that there is an increase in inequality. We know that there's shock on food prices, leaving people with less access to food or no access to food. We know that there is a rise in domestic violence. We know that there is a disruption of peace-building activities. We know that there is an impact on mental health, and so on and so on and so on. So we know those risk factors are increasing, but it's very difficult to come up with a number. How many risk factors do you need to have a conflict? How much is the conflict going to cost society? And so from a decision maker's perspective, it's really difficult to bring peace into the decision-making process when we think about the measure to address COVID-19. So I just want to conclude my presentation with this. It's really important that we're having this conversation today, because if we want to bring peace in the conversation when we respond to COVID-19, we need to have better data. So I'm very excited also to hear our two panelists now. So Branka or Paige, back to you.
Thank you so much, Céline. Thank you for putting a framework around this discussion and for emphasizing the importance of thinking about peace first and even introducing this peace-building lens in not only our discussion, but in policies that we are implementing around COVID. And the paper that you mentioned, I put a link in the chat as well, and I'm really inviting people to look in more details around some of the points and many more that you elaborate in this paper. And thinking in this direction to elaborate more on your point that data matters, and especially data matters a lot in the crisis situations like this, I am inviting Tim Receiver to join our discussion. And as I mentioned, Tim is Director of Programs at Peace Tech Lab. And I think Peace Tech Lab is familiar to many in our audience today, but just to mention that Peace Tech Lab is actually the organization that is using the power of data and new technologies to promote peace around the world. And when I talked with Tim while preparing this session, Tim explained how actually the same with many organizations at the beginning of the crisis, so many other projects had to be paused, and then organizations tried to look at the opportunities to actually directly engage in the pandemic crisis. And I think, Tim, your organization found a really good way to give an example how to do that for many organizations who are still thinking about this. So this is how COVID-19 violence tracker was created. And I think that you also utilize the power of your staff and the diversity of your staff of actually having social scientists and data scientists to participate in this. So it's very nice to have you today here, Tim, and we are looking forward to hear more about your project and insights of your project. Welcome, Tim.
Yeah, thank you, Branka. I appreciate all your help in putting this together, and I don't think I could have had a better segue than what I did from Céline to lead into what I'm going to talk about, which is our COVID violence tracker. And as you mentioned, I work for Peace Tech Lab. I'm the Director of Programs, and for those of you that don't know, we're a nonprofit based on the campus of the U.S. Institute of Peace, and we look at ways that media, data, and tech can help prevent violent conflict around the world. As Céline mentioned, we had a lot of these programs that we have on the ground are obviously canceled or pushed back for this year. And so we were looking at COVID violence. We saw the pandemic spreading back in February and March, and we also saw the violence spreading with this. And before I get into this, I just want to thank our partners at the Digital 100 in the Netherlands, who, without their help, we wouldn't be anywhere near as far along as we are. So the COVID violence tracker, we were looking at the types of violence we were seeing in the spring, and some of these things we were already working on, like hate speech and gender-based violence and misinformation. And so we have a relationship with the Hogan Lovells law firm around the world, and we had their volunteers start collecting the data that we were seeing. We gave them types of violence and types of issues that we wanted to collect on related to COVID-related violence. And they started collecting, they collected new information as well. And what we found is, a few thousand entries of different types of violence, that ways that COVID was manifesting around the world in violence. And we came up with some new entries: excessive use of force, police brutality, resource scarcity, in addition to the ones that we already had. And we kind of applied, we took those types of violence and we put the World Health Organization's definition of violence on top of it, of harm and violence. So these things, it wasn't misinformation for misinformation's sake. It was misinformation leading to injury or violence or death. And the same with xenophobia and racism. So these are just some of the types of violence that we were collecting over the last few months. And we took the results for this volunteer collection in two different directions. One direction was going to, we put this online, we put all of our data online, some of our insights online at COVID-19violence.org. And with this, we were mapping the violence, we were showing some of the trends that we were seeing, and this is static right now. So this is really kind of a snapshot from February up until the end of May. And you can still see all this data. But the other direction we went in is looking at, we can't depend on volunteers full-time to collect all this. And what we wanted to do was move towards an automated approach. So we took the results of the volunteers, we broke those down by the categories. Our partners at the Digital 100, they started running natural language processing on the different types of violence and giving us search queries for each type of violence. And we put those into a Brandwatch, a social listening tool, to start collecting those types of reports that were coming in related to that kind of violence. And so what we are now is we migrated that over to Google Cloud. We were looking at the results, and we have to still clean up the noise. So we've spent the last week taking out some of the, figuring out what was causing the data set to be so noisy, and removing those words and getting a little bit more granular. And that's where we are now, is kind of this round two of our data. By the end of the week, we're going to be pushing out the data sets in a spreadsheet to our partners at Hogan Lovells. So they're going to have around 50 to 60 volunteers that are going to go through. They're going to validate and categorize the types of violence that's coming out. And then we're going to create a natural language processing classification model using this training data set and apply that to the rest of the data. What we're looking at for that's our phase 2 in the next month and a half or so. For our phase 3 approach in January and March, we're going to be putting public dashboards by country, by topic. We're going to be drilling down into, on top of that, that's going to be globally. We're going to be drilling down into 4 to 5 strategic countries that we see violence likely, where Peace Tech Lab has a network. And we're going to establish partnerships in those countries with research universities. I'll give you an example in just a second. But these are places where we already have some partnerships set up on these topics. So, we want to get ahead of violence caused by hate speech or misinformation, that we were already working with groups in Kenya, Nigeria, and South Africa, and India, working on these issues. And what we'd like to do as well is get to why the violence is happening in the first place. So adding additional overlays, say quarantine data We're looking at police brutality. We want to see when the quarantines were enacted to see if there's some kind of correlation with that, or when violence is spiking and there's attacks on medical workers, or when COVID is spiking, is what I meant to say. So this is what we're looking at is having analytics and insights be these recommendations for starting points. And if we can, to provide some kind of early warning, we're setting up focus groups on the ground right now with partners and trying to get to what types of data they need. So as we're collecting this data, as we're building it out, that we're giving them something that they can actually use. We're also, as I mentioned, we're setting up partnerships with universities at the country level. Our first one is Rongo University. We're going to be getting them data on Friday. They're located in Nairobi, and they're going to be validating our data from Kenya, and then adding additional data layers to this, economics, demographics, health data, looking at what the data was saying last year for domestic violence versus this year to see, if we can see what COVID is doing to those issues. And then ultimately, our bread and butter at Peace Tech Lab is connecting to on-the-ground networks. And so that's what we want to do is having Rongo, providing us with either new networks or validating some of the data that we can give to the existing networks that we have. And just one more thing is Sky News is we're talking with them now about being our media partner on this. So providing this COVID violence tracker is being kind of a starting point for their news stories, to be able to kind of add to their news stories with the data that we're showing with what's coming out of the COVID violence tracker. And we're looking at the vaccine news, which was really great news from Pfizer and Moderna and AstraZeneca over the last couple of weeks. And we looked at, just for instance, Pfizer, the first 1.3 billion doses that are coming out, all but 200 million are going to Western countries. And I know AstraZeneca will be different, but we're seeing that vaccines will be wonderful, and it will be something that might not prevent violence in the short term. Over the next year or two, it's likely to spike as much violence as it prevents. So we're looking at a place like Nigeria, if they're not getting a vaccine in as fast as a European country, that there could be riots, there could be attacks on medical workers. So right now we are partnering with groups like Insecurity Insights, for instance, to look at attacks on medical workers on facilities and being able to kind of see where those vaccines go out. So I think with that, I will pause. The only thing I will say is, even when COVID-19 is gone, this methodology, the tools and approaches that we're taking with this COVID-19 violence tracker can be applied to violence more generally around the world, and that's a really great sign. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Tim, for this. It's really insightful to see how a project of this type can be developed. And as you said, it's really good to think long-term as well, not only in general about violence, but I'm afraid that this pandemic is not leaving us anytime soon. And having in mind the way of life we are living, I think we will be handling many more pandemics in our lives. So I think this really comes as a very useful violence tracker and in general experience that you are bringing with this of starting a data-driven project of this size. And this was really interesting hearing how you are engaging a diversity of stakeholders out there. I will come back to this in our Q&A session, but this was a very important segment of the mapping report that we did, looking at all of the stakeholders out there in our ecosystem, for data, for peace building, and actually seeing how we can advance our very own field and the peace building itself through curating these types of partnerships. But before we go more in depth around this, I will invite Rudabeh to join us in this discussion as well. And Rudabeh Kishi, as I said, is the Director of Research and Innovation at ACLED. Again, another organization that I'm sure is familiar to many in our little bubble of peace building, but I'm sure there are a lot of people in our audience that are maybe new to the field. So it would be very good a little bit to hear more about ACLED, and then especially more insights from your work on COVID. So ACLED started a COVID-19 disorder tracker, which provides coverage of the pandemic's impact on political violence and very interesting insights around protests around the world. This violence tracker is monitoring changes in demonstration activity, state repression, even mob attacks, overall rates of armed conflict, and many, many more things. So Rudabeh, it's a pleasure to have you here with us today. Welcome, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much. Let me share my screen. Hopefully it's working. Do you see my slides? Great. Well, hello. Thank you so much for having us and for coordinating this, Branka and Paige. And it's really nice to see so many familiar names in the attendees. So nice to be part of this bubble, as you're mentioning, Branka. I'm Rudabeh. I'm a director of research and innovation at ACLED. And I wanted to start with introducing ACLED to those of you who are familiar, and then diving into our work on the COVID-19 disorder tracker. Let's see if it goes to the next slide. Okay, great. So for those of you not familiar with ACLED, ACLED is the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project. We track and collect data on political violence and demonstration in the world, and data is made for public access. We publish new data on a weekly basis, near real time in nature. While we are now an independent NGO, we were originally born from an academic project about a decade ago now, meaning we come from a background of kind of rigorous and robust methodology. We have a brick and mortar office, so we're fully remote. That made a tap to the COVID world just a little bit easier. Our researchers are based around the world, and they come from a variety of backgrounds, not only culturally as well as experience-wise and training-wise. And ACLED used now by numerous organizations. I think a number of you whose names I see in the attendees now, but those two in the peace and security, so government bodies, international organizations, humanitarian groups, practitioners, etc. And it's being fed into a lot of different types of products, and whether it's early warning systems, monitoring and risk analysis, mapping, programming, dashboards. So like just last week, the special edition of the Munich Security Report, for example, came out that looks at the multifaceted aspect of the coronavirus pandemic, and that makes use of ACLED. So I will try to convince those of you who are not already users by the end of the to way. So ACLED's an event-based data set, meaning the information is quite granular. We code specific day, specific location, and specific engagement. So this means information can be quite flexible to accommodate a wide range of analysis, ranging from local dynamics to country year level for aggregate analysis. We cover a wide range of disorder. So there's information on things like battles, including territorial control, invasions or remote violence. So these are things like air or drone strikes, IEDs, suicide bombings. Violence against civilians include things like abductions, forced disappearances, sexual violence. We also track riots, so violent demonstrations, violence, protests, both peaceful protests that are forcefully put down, go undispersed, and then more largely strategic developments as well. And these account for things like mass arrests, headquarters or bases being established, things like that. And so we also include information on a wide variety of groups and actors, and include coding the specific agent type and their interaction with others. This is really for engagement between various actors and monitoring how these might shift over time. And then lastly, we include conservative fatality estimates too. So our coverage, you can see from the map, is nearly global now. We will be launching Western Europe in January, and we plan to hopefully achieve global coverage by expanding to Canada and Oceania, and then small island states in the coming year too. And those are really the last remaining Black areas on that map. The temporal coverage varies by region. That it largely reflects how we've grown as an organization. And so I've noted that on the slide. More thorough information is of course available on the website if that will impact your work. ACLED began upon a time data project. So the Africa coverage extends back to 97, with other regions shifting since then. So ACLED information comes from a variety of sources, and I think this is something that's really important to us. I think your information is only as good as the information you put into a data set. We draw from thousands of media sources in over 70 languages. These range from national newspapers to local radio. We also increasingly use trusted new media sources. So things like vetted Twitter accounts, like those of journalists or activists, or trusted Telegram channels. We draw on in-depth reporting from international organizations. These are things like Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, the UN. And importantly, we benefit from partnerships with local conflict observatories and local civil society groups on the ground. And this can be especially crucial in accessing information, especially in spaces where media reporting might be lacking, which can be for a number of reasons. Whether it's a closed media environment, whether it's accessibility issues, whether it's frankly the readership of the newspaper and they might be only interested in certain types of things. So we have around 50 such partnerships around the world. I've listed just a couple examples here on the slide, but I'm happy to talk endlessly about sourcing during the so how does ACLED kind of differ from other conflict data sets? We publish data weekly, which is different from a number of other data sets that update maybe annually or monthly at most. All information in ACLED is georeferenced, so you can use it for spatial analysis and monitoring. We capture a range disorder, which is more flexible toward understanding what dynamics actually look like on the ground, as opposed to trying to stick what we see into a static methodology. ACLED has no fatality threshold for inclusion. So this means that violence in quotes actually gets captured, which is really important in how violence manifests differently across different spaces. And this can also be quite integral if you're doing early work to actually catch the early stages of violent campaigns. We monitor thousands of sources intensively, so researchers view new reporting daily. And yet we don't rely solely on media reporting, which would leave us really susceptible to the limits of, especially the limits of English media reporting. And so I think how we benefit from local collaborations, the data collection quite unique. And then lastly, we offer a really open and transparent methodology to allow users to really understand the types of assumptions that they're incurring through the use of data so they can make their own informed decisions about their analysis. And there are what feels like endless methodology documents on the website for those that deign to see them. So in addition to the data we make available, we also have research and analysis that are accessible. So this includes things like weekly regional overviews that offer really quick shot of the data from the week prior, and we have one of these for each of our regions. But we also have infographics, reports, things like that. And then we also offer special projects, in quotes, allow for continued research on a theme. And so one of these special projects, born earlier this year, is our COVID-19 disorder tracker. So the COVID-19 disorder tracker, or CDT for short, is what we've been calling it, includes a number of components. We have a curated data file of disorder events that are directly related to the pandemic. There's a weekly updated map that depicts where such events are occurring around the world. And then there are regular spotlight pieces like infographics and reports that feature how the pandemic is impacting disorder patterns in various spaces. And there's just a couple of thumbnails here on the slide, but there's many, many more of these. on the ACLED website under the CDT project. Importantly, I want to really underline that this analysis here goes beyond the direct effects of the pandemic. Tracking trends in events that are directly related to the pandemic is a bit more straightforward to identify. These are things like violent enforcement of social distancing restrictions, attacks on healthcare workers. The link between this violence and the pandemic is quite clear. It's much more difficult to identify the indirect effects of the pandemic. And these are potentially even more significant. These can be things like how Islamists in Mozambique tripled their rate of attacks on civilians and armed forces in Cabo Delgado, which they were able to do by taking advantage of the state and its otherwise preoccupied, or how the Taliban continued their battles with Afghan forces to further exhaust the state's limited resources, knowing it could in turn result in increased concessions or how in Mexico, the pandemic has really intensified the heightened competition that already exists among the really heightened, fragmented cartels in the country. And so the disruption of markets and trafficking routes as a result of the pandemic has fueled further clashes for control of territory. These types of trends that are really only apparent once you couple this big data type analytical approaches with much more localized contextual knowledge. And this is what we have been really striving to do as part of our work on the CDT by bringing together the trends and data, which we rely on for at ACLED, and then dovetailing this really contextual knowledge of our researchers. And so some of our primary findings we've come across after tracking these trends for a number of months. We saw an initial decline at the start of the pandemic in protests, especially as we were coming out of 2019, which was this year of huge social movements. And so many of those really halt. The virus was initially spreading and so many governments imposed restrictions on it. Though alongside that, we saw an increase associated with the pandemic, perhaps unsurprisingly. So these are things around better access to PPE, ships, etc. And we also saw a rise in new forms of protest, especially given these restrictions on movement. So things like pot banging protests, caravans, balcony protests, things like that. Many of the protest movements that had emerged prior to the pandemic were motivated by this mistrust of governments seen as corrupt, poor economic managers, providing subpar governance. And so in places where the state response to the pandemic has fallen short, governments have really only exacerbated those grievances that already existed. And so we would expect many of these protests, these movements to come back, and some of which have already resurfaced since restrictions on movements have been lifted. In addition to demonstration patterns, there's also been a rise in state that Branka pointed to earlier. So while state of emergency legislation might be considered appropriate, exceptional circumstances, like if you find yourself in a global health pandemic, there's always a risk that these types of laws can be used to suppress opposition and popular mobilization, especially under authoritarian regimes, where there's a higher risk of human rights violations as it is. And we saw such power grabs and democratic backsliding during the pandemic in a number of places, like in Hungary, Egypt. We saw the targeting of opposition and mobilization in Venezuela and Guinea. And there was an uptick too in violence against civilians as governments more likely to suppress citizens and to crack down on opposition and minority groups, often under the guise of lockdown measures. We saw those in Uganda and in the Philippines. We also saw on conflict patterns. So while COVID didn't serve to bring these fires around the world, much to the chagrin of the UN Secretary General, it did serve to impact conflict trends in conjunction with shifts in the strategic goals and behaviors of conflict actors. So for example, some non-state actors like the Islamic State took the opportunity to scale up their activity against state forces, to expand their active territories, to consolidate their positions, and alongside wearing down state forces that were otherwise preoccupied on the battlefield, they also tried to vie for greater legitimacy with local populations, especially in spaces where the government failed to provide the necessities needed during the pandemic. So in spaces like This is like what the Taliban did in Afghanistan, or gangs do in the Northern Triangle. And simultaneously, competition amongst non-state actors also rose in certain spaces, between communal groups in Africa or among cartels in Mexico. And then we also saw a rise in vigilantism. Providers are often formed, even outside the pandemic, and active protect their communities, especially when the state isn't trusted to guarantee security of those spaces. And they can come together formally in an organized fashion, or spontaneously, like vigilante mobs. And so we saw an increase in activity by these types of groups, especially targeting those that were thought to be spreading the virus. So whether it's those not wearing masks in China in like the very early days of the pandemic, or Muslims in India as a result of like misinformation campaigns, health workers across a whole lot of number of contexts. And then we also saw a rise in unrest in prisons, especially around the fears of close quarters and poor detention conditions really fueling the spread. So for those of you interested in using the data for your own analysis, you can access ACLED data in a number of ways. There's a data export tool, there's an API, there are curated data files. Like I mentioned earlier, data are updated weekly. And so in order to do so, for those of you who might be longtime users, but haven't known that we've switched to a registration model, you need to register with ACLED first to generate an access key. This is free, you still get access to data. It just lets us know a little bit more about who's using the data. And you can do this by going to developer.acleddata.com. Interested in the COVID tracker specifically, you can navigate there on the ACLED website, special, and then COVID tracker, or using that URL. And I can speak to some of the challenges in doing kind of data-driven work, or especially around the COVID tracker, the Q&A. And if you have further questions about the data, about our findings, etc., please feel free to contact me. And for those of you on Twitter, just a quick plug that I hope you'll follow us at ACLED Info, and where you can hear about some of our latest special projects and larger data releases. And you can do so via our mailing list and sign up for. There you might hear things like how we are extending coverage of East Asia and Latin America and the Caribbean to include 2018 just in the next couple of weeks. So there's lots of exciting news like that there. All right.
Thank you, Rudabeh, for this really interesting presentation, and thank you for guiding us through your work and helping us to understand a bit how this entire data-driven work functions before COVID, and then again seeing how a project like this can happen out of the crisis. We have an immediate follow-up question for you, and I will read it now because it's connected to some of the contents that you mentioned, and this is, are you seeing any correlation between COVID and conflict in specifically sub-Saharan Africa? I think this is a very specific question, but I would also like to put it in a bigger framework maybe, and stressing how important it is to look at the context as such. I like this notion a lot, that the data is basically empty without the context in which we are looking at that data and trying to find some meaning. So I don't know if you have an immediate maybe comment on this, on the situation in sub-Saharan Africa.
Yeah, we have seen some shifts there. I think if you go on the tracker page, we have a few spotlights on specific countries. And more largely, we saw some shifts in patterns of communal groups that I think I mentioned. And I think something I should have mentioned is that I see that you've shared the foreign policy piece. Thank you. That has some of the overarching outline, top lines. But we also have a much longer report too on the tracker page that really unpacks where we saw the biggest changes, where we've seen different changes in different types of violence. And so that might be of interest too. I can momentarily drop a link to that in the Q&A.
Yes, thank you, Rudabe. And yes, I've put this article, I've read it before this session and find it really, really interesting to see these direct impacts or direct or indirect impacts of COVID. So I really recommend to our audience to have a look at this as well. And then I will bring the discussion. In a way back to Tim, but I would also like to try to make this more conversation between the two of you, because we have a really interesting question that came before you, Rudabe, started your presentation from Liz. And Liz is asking, have you considered using open source and other data like ACLED or open sourcing the data itself? So Tim, this is more for you to see if there are any links to ACLED and for us to understand how the two organizations in the ecosystem are maybe engaging in this way. And then we have another question for you, Tim, coming from Wesley Hayden. And Wesley is asking, what does the data validation process look like for Rongo University? And I think this question can again be applied to validation in general. So maybe going outside of your partner university, I'm asking you as well how you are dealing with this validation of different information that you are finding online. And then I will bring back to Rudabe as well to see how ACLED is handling this and maybe even handling this huge problem of misinformation and disinformation we are struggling with today.
Yeah, and I think those are two really great questions. On the ACLED one, on the open source, we were cataloging a whole bunch of open source data sets that we can use as we roll this out in different countries. And ACLED has come up so many times in the past year, and we're looking at how to integrate them now. We had a long discussion on Friday with our partners at the Digital 100, and I was thinking this is the perfect segue to talk to Dr. Kishi about this and bring her, I'd love to talk to her. I sent her a message before the session today about incorporating the data. So I think it's, just figuring out where the intersections are with the data, what we're missing that ACLED could provide, and vice versa, what we could provide to ACLED that might be of interest to them. For the validation, that's a really good question as well. We're starting off with all the data is going to be going out to Rongo on Friday, as well as our validation team at Hogan Levels. So our 50 to 60 volunteer validators. And for the Hogan Levels staff, it's looking like they'll get a spreadsheet of representative data that they'll go through, and they'll classify the data, whether it's COVID-related violence, what type of violence it is, is this a specific incident or is it a trend? So is it an incident of domestic violence, or is it a report that domestic violence is peaking around the country? It's just kind of making the difference between those two. For Rongo, we'll be exporting all the COVID violence data that we have for Kenya, and they're kind of our test case to see how this will work. And so that's, we're going to be looking to them to do some of the kind of validation work that Hogan Levels is doing, but to go beyond that. And I don't know exactly what that looks like yet. We put some general guidelines together for validating the data, but it's still unclear. We'll be figuring this out over December, and I hope at that point we'll have a model where we can bring in other research institutes around the world in different countries to kind of take our lessons learned from Rongo and apply that and be a little bit faster going forward.
This is maybe also an invitation for other similar partners and universities in other countries as well to think about this in this direction. I think that would be really nice to see more cooperations of this kind happening. I remember, Tim, when we talked about this, we talked a lot about the challenge of language as well, and how many of our analyses today are based on English. And I think naturally you mentioned as well that you are looking into: Kenya, Nigeria, South Africa. I assume that's all related to language, but hopefully we can think in the direction of scaling this work in other languages as well. And maybe talking about this, I will now bring the word back to Rudabe, and maybe ACLED can share with us more about your experiences on validation of data, and even including different languages. Or you mentioned you are working with a lot of organizations, grassroots organizations as well throughout the world. So can you share with us a bit your experiences with this?
Sure. So there's so many components, I guess. So firstly, when it comes to, I mean, your last point you were mentioning around, analysis and engaging with universities and doing work beyond just English. I mean, I think that is so important to us, especially given that we are such a global organization that the majority of our staff, English is not their first language. And so we work quite closely with universities and others on doing joint reports. I can actually drop a link in just a moment. We worked with our partners at Universidad de los Andes in Colombia around the targeting of vulnerable groups, especially ex-FARC combatants, around the pandemic and how COVID has did this. And that report you can read in Spanish, of course, but also in English. So I mean, that's really something that we've been pushing to do more and more of, to engage more and more of our users. When it comes to validation around and misinformation, especially this rise in fake news, I think it makes it so that it's our curating of sourcing profiles for each context that we review, I think, is so important, and how we add sources to that list. All sources have bias, right? It's just they are different biases, and we need to know how to account for these. Even the most reputable international newspaper, something that we might all read, it will have biases in the form of what information it's showing you. It will show things based on what its readership wants to read. It will show things based on where its foreign correspondents have access to. So in that sense, you have to complement this kind of information with what you seem to be missing, and then, of course, once you curate a sourcing profile to try to capture things effectively, we then at ACLED, at least, we will engage with experts, local groups, etc., to kind of try to ensure that the trends we're seeing in the data reflect their local realities. A way that we've seen to kind of combat the biases that we'll see sometimes in media, and how biased media can be will also, of course, vary in different spaces. Places like Afghanistan make it really difficult for reporters to access much of the country, just based on not only war but geography. In spaces like parts of Central Asia, there's quite a closed media environment, so you have to kind of account for use of, let's say, by certain people to be able to capture what's happening. We try to at least tamp the misinformation coming in by, we don't crowdsource, mostly because we have found there can be so much noise on social media when we know who the accounts are. We do use accounts of those accounts that we trust, because they can be access to really great information that might not make it into traditional media. But we've really waded into those waters delicately. And in addition to that, the diversification around non-English media is really important too, especially in spaces where English is not the primary language. We did a comparison, looking at some other conflict data sets that rely on English language media, and looking at the trends, for example, around the end of December. And, unsurprisingly, you see quite different trends, because English language media kind of reporters are often celebrating the holidays and not reporting it. So you see different trends in that regard. So I think it's really important to kind of take into account these various things. And I can drop a few different resources from ACLED for those who might be interested in reading more.
Thank you. Thank you to both of you for emphasizing these issues and especially this issue around biases. We, in the meantime, got another question. I think, Rudabe, you managed to tackle this through your previous response, exactly around this, due to the nature of the information collected, political and human rights, and so on, how ACLED makes sure that the data comes from unbiased resources. And I think this question came as a very important one when we were doing our mapping exercise as well. And I think hopefully it will get more and more space. As you said, our products depend on the data that we basically put in them. And I don't, I'm not a fan of this expression, garbage in, garbage out, but basically does explain the process. And the more we concentrate on the quality of the data and the diversity of resources that we have, the better insights we will have. This is one of these big challenges that I wanted us to come back in the Q&A session. So we already started talking a bit about this in a bit. But at this point, I would like to bring Céline back in the conversation. And we got a very interesting question from Mauricio Calderon, who is asking, do you believe the new social order imposed by pandemic control attempts will change in a permanent manner the way we think about understanding peace through data, globally and locally? And then Mauricio is explaining understanding the road to positive peace through data. So I think, Céline, you did a very interesting and gave us some interesting points regarding this question. Would you like to elaborate more?
Thank you, Branka. Maybe something that is really important about positive peace is that so it's already really difficult to track violence, events, incidents, and causes, but what we're trying to do when we talk about positive peace, and I work particularly on prevention of armed violence, so how can you do something before it actually happens, is to understand what are those risk factors that are increasing and how do you address them early, and measuring those, I think, is still one of our biggest challenges. First, really understanding what is a risk factor, because not any social injustice is necessarily a risk factor for violence. Understand that it's context specific, obviously. In each country is going to be different, but also in each region of the country is going to be different. And so I am hoping that this pandemic is going to bring more attention to those factors and to the necessity to understand them better, measure them better, work on them earlier, so we don't get to the stage where we are dealing with violence and we don't know how to get out of those protracted conflict that we're seeing worldwide. So I don't know if that's going to lead to that. I certainly hope it will.
Thank you, Céline, for emphasizing this, and I can't find a better way to send a message at the end of our discussion today as well. So I think points that you made in the introduction and now, that it's very important to think about early actions as well, and the prevention work, and how much data can actually help us in this process. Data is important. I will take this as one of the conclusions from this discussion, but before we conclude, unfortunately, we are already at the end of the hour. Time is flying. At the end, I would like to give the final words to Tim and Rudabe to share their final thoughts about this work, and maybe leave it on a more positive note as well, maybe thinking about this community of practice as well. And we have a lot of people joining us from this community and finding or trying to find ways to contribute to this positive peace. So Tim and Ru, do you have any final thoughts or messages to our audience?
Well, from Peace Tech Lab side, you know, what we lack in funding, we make up for in volunteers and enthusiasm and kind of the mission. And we've seen a whole bunch of interns. You know, I mentioned Digital 100, but we've got volunteers from the DC government, from Georgia Tech. You know, just a lot of people that have come forward and really helped us out with this. And if anybody on the call here would like to partner on the COVID violence tracker, I'm Tim at peacetechlab.org and would love to talk to you. Thank you very much.
Thanks. I'll kind of build off of that to say, I mean, the point around, access to resources to kind of keep this information, important information kind of coming. I think so often, and perhaps Tim can relate, so that when you have, open source kind of information, or whether it's dashboards and things like that, you forget that there's a lot that goes into making those, whether it's volunteers or paid researchers or what have you. I'd also say that one of the, I think, biggest challenges that I'm hoping we will start surmounting is, there's kind of great data or great like specific dashboards and projects and things like that, but making sure that policymakers, government entities, humanitarian groups, they can make use of the data. We've really noticed that data literacy is, so often kind of assumed, perhaps amongst those of us here who might be really interested in big data, but that's not necessarily the case with everyone who's making decisions. And so really what we're going to be focusing on at ACLED is making a real push towards improving and supporting, the capacities around data literacy, around working with data, whether it's ACLED, but also, how to draw conclusions from it, to kind of make sure that people are working with things correctly and making the best use of it. So I think that's perhaps the next step, the next challenge, and maybe we'll have another dialogue around that soon.
Thank you. Absolutely. This is exactly why we are organizing, or one of the reasons why we are organizing Data for Peace dialogues, to really connect this community, to invest in informing people, to help in understanding the power of data and why data is important. For the very end of the session, Paige, would you like to? So then it's coming from me. Thank you to NYU CIC for hosting this and for really starting the dialogues. This is the second one. We will have a series of dialogues happening every single month on different topics. We will be covering the power of satellite imagery and image processing, natural language processing, machine learning, but also the power of people, as Tim said, the power of volunteers and crowdsourcing and all of the stakeholders that are out there. So we hope you will be joining us in December for our December edition. And this is a huge thank you from our side to Céline, Rudabe, Tim, Paige, and thank you all participants for your amazing questions and comments and for sharing the resources. And thank you again, and I look forward to seeing you in December.
Thanks for coordinating this, Branka.
Thank you, Branka.
Thank you, Branka.
Thank you all.